Arifa, can I go to families now, and then maybe we can go back to kind of creativity and writing. I was really struck with your memoir, the way it really shows the way in grief we often have to go back over events, you know, bit by bit, rethink the death, rethink the relationship. And your father's relationship with your sister and his relationship with you was so different. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Oh, I can't hear you. You're on mute.
Sorry, you hear me now? Yeah. And do say, there's somebody in the chat who said they couldn't hear me well, and I think I've got quite a soft voice, so I need to speak up. People should write if they still can't hear me. I think for me, in a way, grief brought on an audit of family and of relationships as a whole. Oh, great, it's better, says Pauline, thanks. It brought on a sort of audit of my life, where I am, who my sister was to me, where my sister and I were in the family, you know, in family positioning, and led us. We had a really intimate sisterly relationship. We shared a bedroom, we shared everything. Actually, she was my biggest friend as well as my sister. I looked up to her. She was 2 years older, but so much more worldly, better read. She's the one who introduced a lot of her to that I now have for art and for literature, books. She told me what to read, what to see. She dressed better than I did. You know, I really looked up to her as my, you know, bigger sister, much more sophisticated sister. And then there was a breaking away. I went to university and she just sunk into depression and serious eating disorder, sort of bulimia and anorexia, that really was to last throughout her life. I didn't say she died at the age of 4. In 2016, she was just 45 and I was 43. So unlike Gavanndra and Cathy, you know, we were both grown-ups when this happened. And unlike Gavanndra and Cathy, in terms of memory and when you write things down, I started writing about my sister actually in the year of the pandemic, very soon after she died. And I think that makes a difference. I still found weird things happening with memory, and it was raw, but I was addressing the grief. I was forced to address the grief by writing about it. But in terms of family dynamic, you know, and writing the story of a sibling's death, it was interesting because for a start, I'd had a really difficult early family life. My family had emigrated from Lahore in Pakistan to London. I was born in London, but 2 years earlier, my sister had been born in Lahore. My parents had had an arranged marriage. They both liked each other and they were introduced by families, but they were happy about this arranged marriage. My mother was only 26 or 27, but my father was a lot older, almost 40. And my mother didn't know it at the time, but my father had been deeply in love with a woman in London. He'd lived in London and married a woman in London, of German heritage. They'd had a marriage and a relationship for 7 years before he left her, divorced, came back to Pakistan, only because his family put pressure on him to do so. And I think he left, you know, in hindsight, and talking to my mother and talking to my uncles on my dad's side, I think he left sort of the love of his life, and he felt forced back into a life, far more traditional marriage and family life that he didn't want, actually. And it seems as if he'd gone down the wrong path. So when my mother became pregnant with my sister, he left for Pakistan. He left Pakistan for London with the aim of having a home there, bringing, you know, his new wife and his unborn daughter to London. They were separated for a while, and for the first year of my sister's life, actually. And when my sister met my father for the first time, she was over a year old. It was at Heathrow Airport. My mother had come with great excitement for this new life with this daughter who was born without the father there. There was a sort of profound disconnect between them. And my sister cried. She was scared. Who is this strange man? My father seemed to respond to that. And in a way, even though it sounds ludicrous, that bad meeting at Heathrow Airport, my sister at the age of 13 months old, set a pattern of distrust and distance between them. When I came along 2 years later, I was the favorite. I was loved and adored very lavishly and openly. And there was a positioning that took place in the family. I was the adored daughter. She wasn't. She was sort of cast out. And my brother came along afterwards, but it didn't knock me off the perch in a way. And that relationship, while my sister and I were incredibly close as teenagers, that her resentment and sadness and rage over that unfair positioning for no reason that she could control, being cast out by her father, that really got in the way of our sisterly relationship and our intimacy, actually. And she became jealous and resentful of me. And there was great moments of closeness where we spoke about this difficult childhood positioning, the fact that neither of us could have controlled it, and yet there were feelings that kind of festered and built up, and distrust built up between my sister and I, and because of that positioning. So in my 20s and 30s, there were periods of closeness with her, and then periods of estrangement. And when she died so suddenly, it was followed by regret, because there had been that estrangement before she was taken to A&E when I ran, and made up, and we talked through things, and I saw the artwork that she'd been making, because she'd returned after a lifetime of depression to art school, and she showed me a bit of her art, and I discovered the person she'd become through her art after so long of a few years of not seeing her. And so when she died, there was enormous amounts of regret over that positioning, questions about why my father had done that. He has had dementia for the last 10 years. He couldn't answer those questions. They're locked away. And how do you make sense of that? How do you answer questions that can never be answered by certain people? When my sister wasn't around to help me answer some of the questions that remained around about her. My father couldn't help me. I couldn't access the past through him. So there were other ways I had to find to answer those questions or come to the terms with. There are certain questions that cannot be answered when somebody dies. They do leave these loose ends. You can't make sense of everything even through writing about it. You can come to peace with some of the unanswered questions. And the other thing about family and writing down grief and the next step to publication is, I think you have to consider not only the fact that you're writing about your grief. I was honouring my sister, actually. I felt she'd been silenced by so many systems. People with depression and mental health difficulties and eating disorders are often misunderstood, mistrusted in the system, and silenced, I think, by the system, or treated like they're not to be trusted. Their testimony is not to be trusted. And I wanted partly this book to be about that, to give her a voice, strangely. But in doing that, I was exposing the family's sort of darkness and the contested realities, how I see my childhood and the positioning and all the things that my mother and father did may not be the way that she might have seen it, or the way that my brother sees it, or the way that my mother sees it. And also there's a case of my father who's still alive, who I'm writing about, but I haven't consulted because I can't. So there's the ethics around it as well. It's such a big thing, and I do think that grief brings on this audit about everything: who you are, who my sister was, who my father was, and my mother. What were they doing, raising us in a way that they obviously felt that was the only way they could. But I ended up questioning everything about everything, and then laying it on the page and laying it bare, and knowing that, fearing that it would upset my family more than the grief had upset them.